I'm awfully glad you stayed with us, because when Chris Turner comes to town, I always try to grab him for as many conversations as I can. So we talked about Afghanistan. We could have talked about it all day, but we had to condense it a bit. And now we're going to talk about the other countries that are involved in the rather not too lovely process in the Middle East, and the Levant countries and plus. So I want to talk about, let's throw the map up and show people where we're going with this, because I think it's easy to get. We're going to start in Syria, but if you see Syria and Lebanon, and then Israel and Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, and then we're going to go down to Kuwait and Bahrain and talk about, and Saudi Arabia is an interesting player in all of this, and we want to be sure to talk about that as well. And of course, at the bottom of the Red Sea there is Yemen, and Yemen is kind of an interesting country at this moment as well. So we're going to move west from Afghanistan into Iran and Iraq and the other countries of the Levant. And do notice that the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers come together there in the cradle of civilization. So we're just kind of getting oriented as to where we're going, Chris. Shall we start with, I think I might want to start with Syria, because Syria is kind of uppermost in the news, and I heard that Aleppo is about to fall. And if Aleppo falls, then Syria probably will go back under Bashar al-Assad al-Aziz. And there is another minority, he's a Ba'athist, and there's another minority that's ruling with an iron hand. Talk about Syria just for a moment here.
Well, again, I think we have to simplify it slightly and say to everyone that there are Sunnis and Shias. Our concern is that even though the Shias make a minority of the Arab world, 20% of this 1.5 billion Arab Muslims,
that's a lot of folks.
The Sunnis are the other the majority, the 80%. Our problem is that there is a concentration of Shias in the oil-rich portion that we're talking about right now. So as long as we have this inner fighting between these two religions, then you're not going to be able to consolidate a country, as we've tried to do with Syria and Jordan. And as we remember historically, that was all kind of not a single country, but part of the Ottoman Empire, and really ruled by these tribal entities.
See, we keep coming back to the same thing, tribal.
It's very tribal. And then there's an alliance, and I think that was part of Muhammad's mission, was to bring together these tribes under a common religious flag, so to speak, and give them this brotherhood that's so critical in any religion. I mean, do unto others as you would do unto yourself.
Well, and the Sunnis and the Shias are not too far apart, except the line along which
we saw that when they announced a new caliph, which is the term. Muhammad was the first caliph. They had three, and then Ali. And Ali was
Muhammad's brother, or
he was a son-in-law and cousin. So the problem is that it was a blood connection that Muhammad had said you shouldn't do. You should just pick the best man. So that was the original fraction. And being a minority, which Iran is Shia, and if you think of the mentality of a minority, you have to fight harder, you have to be crazier, because you're fighting really a non-win situation. So the suicide bombing that we're suffering so from today is not from the Sunnis. The Sunnis never practiced that. That was not part of their religion. But the Shias, who were being beaten down, they killed Ali, they killed all his family to try to stop this bloodline.
And Chris, as this Sunni Shia apple cart turns up, there's a lot of frustration on the Sunni group, and they were not asked to be part of the government in Iraq. They were just summarily dumped, and so that's not a good thing.
But they were in power prior to us taking Iraq over.
Exactly.
So as a minority, they used violence to an extreme to dominate a majority. So in a sense, but again, it's not a simple solution, because they've got control, as the Kurds are Sunnis, they've got control of the oil.
The Kurds are really doing well up there.
And they've got control of the oil. So again, I think what we all have to think about, and I think this was pointed out to us in the Lawrence of Arabia movie, is that these people have lived without our influence, without our involvement for centuries.
And there's a lot of resentment, I think.
We became involved for one reason, and that's oil.
3 letters.
Yeah. And I think as long as we're as fascinated with the automobile as we are, and are willing to abuse ourselves with hours of traffic jams so that we can individually drive
and carbon monoxide fumes.
Up to a full-size pickup by
but
ourselves.
to go back a little bit to Iran, here we have a minority running the country. If we switch over to Syria, Bashar is a minority. He's a Ba'athist, and he's a Muslim, but he's a minority. And how is he in such strong control of Syria?
Well, we've got to look back at the aid that he's gotten from the Russians and from us. I mean, we made him very powerful. I think it's a simple formula. We can make friends with a regime and be very supportive of that regime as long as it benefits our end goal. And I think we've run into problems because these guys are erratic. They changed their personalities. Hussein worked for us in Iraq at one time. We were his big supporter. I think all of these puppet governments, as you might say, have been at one time or another aligned with one of the superpowers, either us or the Russians.
Well, and sometimes I really have to say that we change our goals as well.
We do.
And that's, it's like, I don't know. In the land of the blind, a one-eyed man is king. I just kind of feel our way around here, and so I.
Well, and you were speaking of Saudi Arabia, and I think one of the things that it's such a closed country. Here's a country that doesn't allow tourists. You cannot get a tourist visa to go to Saudi Arabia, so it's really a closed society, and it is very, very fundamentalist.
Now they're Sunnis, aren't they?
They're Sunnis,
yes.
But they're very, very fundamental. So their alliance to the Taliban and their support of the Taliban through bin Laden for years and years and years, decades literally, and building literally thousands of madrasas in the refugee camps along the border to spread this fundamentalism, this Wahhabi philosophy.
Well, I read someplace where the Saudi kings really didn't want to fool with the government, so this is a number of years ago. So they left it to the mullahs to run the government, and they did it, as they say, in spades.
Yeah.
And that's how the Saudis kind of got into that
hard mold.
And the ruling family of Saudi Arabia is rather Western. I mean, they're all Western educated. They're not.
Interesting you should say that. When I met bin Laden in Afghanistan, he was a young man, it was in 1985, and he was complaining. He didn't speak Pashto, but he spoke English, and he was sent by the Saudis to administer the funds. We were matching funds. So if we put $1 million into the fight against the Russians, the Saudis would match our funds. And they decided how to spend it, though, of course.
Yeah, of course.
And he said at the time, I resent the fact that you spoiled the Saudi family. They're hypocrites. They go to France, they fly in their private jets, they drink sharab, which is the word for alcohol, they indulge in females, all these things that are converse to the religious laws that they're so devoutly devoted to. And he says it's our fault because we gave them the money to do it.
Our fault being Americans'
yes,
fault, yeah.
Yes, the Western world.
Well, what kind of a person did you find him when you met him in '85?
He was very driven, He was not a real brave man. He was living outside of Kandahar, where the big battle was, in Agwanda Valley. So he was living in a very safe place. And he was bragging to me at the time, and this was early, in 1985, he was saying how many of these madrasas they had successfully built in the camps, in the refugee camps in Pakistan, and how they were, bringing Sharia law to the masses that way. And they trained the suicide bombers. That was the beginning.
Did you find him an ambitious man?
He was very driven. I mean, to do what, here's a man who had access to funds. I mean, he was a very, very wealthy man.
Well, bin Laden came from a wealthy family.
Very, very wealthy man.
Yeah.
And could have played the game and continued in his father's construction business. And so, I'll say this. The name Osama is the most popular name in the tribal territory for young boys. It's the most used name now. And in all my travel in that area, and I've had the fortune to be able to be in that area on several occasions, how could you dislike a man who hid out in a cave and passed out $100 bills?
That's hard to do.
And he,
yes,
and I'll say this for him: he to these people, he spoke something they understood. He spoke fundamentalism, Sharia law. They understood this. They've been trained already in this. He brought it to a higher level, and he really did. I think the suicide bombing is not part of the Quran. I think that particular element he did because of the power.
Power is a very heady and addictive thing, is it not? You know, we've talked about the Taliban a lot, but there are a number of groups here, and I think we tend to get them all mixed up, and they're really not cohesive groups, as I understand it. So let's take one at a time. Let's talk about Hamas.
Well, again, and I've had the good fortune of having some Palestinian friends. I think they were disenfranchised from their tribal territory. Maybe they weren't using it properly. Maybe they weren't willing to cooperate with this new element, the Jewish settlements, for whatever reason. And they were a minority. I think when you torture someone and abuse them as much as the Palestinians have been abused and displaced, you get resentment and you get anger.
And there is a vacuum that comes, and when there is a vacuum, it is filled.
It's filled.
It is filled. Right. Okay, let's talk about Hezbollah.
You know, and they're two.
Now they're different kinds of groups.
You know, all these groups have agendas, but they're all applying this same basic principle of Sharia law. Live by this law, and then they entwine these other jihadist attitudes in these poor people, based on this base of religion.
Okay, so we could be safe in saying they all have the same base.
And they're all hypocrites. I mean, I've been at orgies with some of these Hamas leaders. You know, I mean, when I was boat captain in Dubai and
they drink
100-foot. Oh, they drink, and they're women. I mean, it's ugly. But again, who they are and what they do are two separate entities.
Well, and they're located in different spots. Hezbollah comes out of where? Not Yemen.
Well, Lebanon.
Lebanon.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's all basically the same area. I mean,
well, it is.
Yeah,
it is.
And we've given it this abstract division of territories recently.
Well, let's talk about the latest to come on the scene, and that's ISIS, the Syrian. What is it? The United Army of Syria, or whatever it is. Yeah. They are really right wingers.
Yeah. Well, and you have said it yourself. Radical extremes tend to pick up momentum when people are panicked, when people are in turmoil. They grab to these more radical answers.
Because they give them an answer.
They give them an answer where the moderates have already floundered.
Right.
And can't come up with an answer.
No. So. And they also, in this part of the world, they seem to operate better with a really strong leader, even though he might be not as benevolent as one might hope. Let's switch over just for a minute from Bashar to General Sisi in Egypt. Now, see, they had an opportunity to be a democracy. They were going to have, but it didn't work very well. So everybody then got behind the military man, General Sisi, and I'm not sure. And now they have persecuted the Muslim Brotherhood. Those guys are in big trouble.
Well, but that's a reoccurring theme. It happened in Pakistan.
Sure.
You know, every time we put on a democratic facade, the strong man's going to come up to the surface. And that's just going to happen.
I'm always reminded of Karl Marx's theory, you know, of all this equality and all that. It doesn't work because there are always people that are smarter. There are always people that are driven, stronger, ambitious, and those are the people that come to the top. And often those are really tough individuals because you have to be to reach to
rise above the masses.
Yeah.
And I think communism failed based on that principle alone.
I do.
And capitalism being a free market, if you want to, I think Obama's a good example of first generation immigrant who's become president.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Putin he's a KBG man still.
It goes back to my earlier statements about the mafia took over Russia. And Putin was government mafia because the concept in mafia or KGB, there are no rules.
There are no. But see, we always come back to the same thing: the lack of rules.
Yeah. No.
And good luck.
I think it gives us a lot of security to think that we're humane. We're not butchering people for no good reason. No. But in a war, fear is what wins.
And let's talk about a war and fear. We are deluged in this area of the world with refugees. I mean, Jordan is, and that's a soft border there, and we might throw up that map again and look at the border between Jordan and Iraq, and you see they're all right there. And look at Jordan is deluged with refugees, as move to the north and a little bit to the west, and you see Turkey. Well, Turkey's getting a load of Syrian refugees. Jordan's getting them from probably Iraq. I don't know.
Iran's absorbed Afghan refugees for years, and I'm sure it will take more from this conflict.
Yeah.
You know, and the problem with refugees, and it's what caused us all our trouble in Afghanistan, was that you can manipulate these poor people, and you get a sinister source
well, you talk
going
about
in.
Panicked. They are in a huge panic.
Yeah. And that's really what created the Palestine problem. They were forced into a refugee status.
Yeah.
So we can't just have refugees without coming up with some kind of solution for it.
No,
I mean,
cannot.
are you just going to have more festering young boys that are going to, you know, commit suicide?
With nothing to do.
With nothing to lose.
Well, they have nothing to lose because they have no future. They have no education to speak of. They have nothing to do but mill around and
try to get enough care to be fed every day.
To be fed every day. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
it's a sad
exactly right.
statement, yeah, that they're driven from their homeland.
What about Kuwait, Bahrain?
You know, and I've been in these countries. I actually worked in Bahrain for a year, and I think what they've been able to do in areas like Dubai, of course, the oil revenues make them very affluent, and then they've had this immigration attitude where you go there only as an immigrant. You're always on a work visa. So let's take the United Emirates. There are 400,000 people in the 7 Emirates, native, and 4.5 million foreign workers. But yet they're not local, so they're never going to face the problem Egypt had. They never had the masses rebelling. They just kick them out.
They just kick them out.
They do the same thing in Bahrain, the same thing in Kuwait. They keep very, very tight controls over a small group of people, which are the natives, and they're living like kings. Now, I will say this, and we saw it in Saudi Arabia, and we see it in Yemen. Some of these rich people, like bin Laden, they're disenfranchised by this money. They don't, you know, you take somebody, you give him just enough money to survive, but he's not really in a position to get a wife and get a house, and yet he doesn't have the incentive to do that because you're feeding him, you know. And the young Saudi boys get a stipend, you know, $2,000 or $3,000 a month at a house. Well, that's enough to keep them lazy. But then you get the ones that get angry, they get disenfranchised, and they become the jihadist. You know, they're the ones that become the extremist. That's that pendulum swinging the other way.
And you know, the jihadists of whatever stripe they may be, they're organized.
Yeah.
They provide training. Yeah. They provide food. Yeah. It's the same general approach. Give them food, and then you can mold them.
Exactly, and that's how the madrasas in the refugee camps are working. They're feeding these young boys. So they get them in the school. Once they get them in the school, it's a ripe mind to be plowed in whatever direction they want
them to go. Yeah, and they don't seem to desert. I mean, they stick with it once they're.
Yeah. And it's a very
because they are very strong in their religious beliefs. I mean, it seems to me, it's so interesting to me, because it seems like the whole thing is a cycle, and it seems to come down to the same set of, I don't know if you call them problems, the same set of facts that underscore everything that's happening.
Yeah. Well, again, our fascination with the automobile and our abuse of the fossil minerals are part of the problem, and we can't ignore it. And if we want to answer it, a lot of it can be answered here, not over there.
Well, you know, and I'm so sad when I've been to Syria, and the people in Syria are lovely people, lovely. And the archaeological opportunities to see things and to savor the past in Syria are wonderful. And I have a bracelet at home that I bought in the souk in Aleppo, and I look at that bracelet, it makes me sick when I hear that they've blown themselves up and their country up. And why are they willing to sacrifice everything and have a country that is literally destroyed?
You know, I think as we become, in satellite transmission of imagery, we've become a global economy. And these people have access. I mean, even in the outlying areas of Syria, these people have cell phones. They're getting smartphones, and they 3G these areas very quickly, so their communication's tremendous. And so as you as a have-not get to see more of what the haves are doing, there's got to be hostility. So I think greedy men can manipulate the masses, and it's going on as we speak in every direction. So.
Perhaps one of the keys to a better world is education.
Again, I think education. I think we could get caught up a little less in what we own and more in who we know, and develop relationships, and make that our power. People being
there we
social.
are with those 3 cups of tea again.
Yeah. Exactly.
And maybe it's rules are kind of a peculiar thing, unless you can really get people to live those rules. They're not terribly, but the Sharia law has
real teeth.
Real teeth. It does.
And I lived under that law for many, many years, and there's no misunderstanding. And you just don't do what's going to get you.
You just don't do it. You don't think about it because it's not worth it.
So there's a real feeling of security. There really is a feeling of, and everybody's under the same rules, so there's no discrimination. You don't get
rich or poor. It doesn't.
Muhammad said when he saw people coming to the mosque to pray, and the ones with gold and silver and silk robes were being seated in the front, even though they came late. He said, "Stop! This is not right. I don't care what you're wearing. If you come late, you sit in the back. You don't get to sit in the front." And in contrast, he wore a brass ring with a Yumi agate, which is a very inexpensive stone. And they relish that stone today because.
And I guess the lesson to be learned there is that we have to decide what's important and prioritize our lives as such.
Yeah, and Jesus said the same when he went to the temple and saw the money changers. That's what got him in trouble.
It does sometimes. Yes, it does. Well, and yes, but I guess I have to say that there are always those who are willing to stand up and be counted, for good or bad.
Oh, yeah.
They are willing to stand up and be counted. So you have to give them some credit, because it's not always safe to be vocal.
Yeah, no, that's very true, very true.
If you had to pick some leadership in this part of the world, who would you pick?
Well, if they have, and you say it's not a democratic system, tribal law is very democratic. The tribal elders, and I think we've lost, to some degree, respect for our elders, and in a very primitive environment like that, they give respect to the elders, and they accept the fact that they've experienced more, have more knowledge based on those experiences. So the tribal elders get together and they decide. In Afghanistan, they call it the royal jirga. They decide what's going to happen, and it is a vote. So it is a democratic process on that level. And they
do talk about it.
Of course, it's a debate, and they discuss the things, and enough of the people have to agree for it to be a majority. And then the tribe will go in that direction. The elders will say, okay, it's been voted on. I know all of us don't agree on it. Again, when the world is fragmented as badly as it's fragmented, for us to come up with a common solution is impossible.
But the world is somewhat of a dichotomy, because it is terribly fragmented, and yet we are all world citizens because of the economy of world trade has changed the whole. We cannot
be isolationists.
We cannot be isolationists. We just can't do it, and therefore, within that fragmentation, we have to find some sense of the ability to coalesce in some way. Does it not strike you that way?
Well, and I think one of the things that makes it hard to coexist are the differences. So if we could perhaps try to be less different. I know as a person who's lived his adult life in other countries, as guest of other cultures, the very first thing I try to do is to blend in, from the way I speak to what I wear.
You blended into Afghanistan for 40-some years.
I think it's imperative for us, if we're going to get along, to lessen the differences. Look at the racial strife here. These are differences. One man's one color, another man's another color, so there are differences.
But it's like Animal Farm.
It is. It is.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad,
Exactly.
and why?
Exactly.
It's not. Those are not insurmountable differences. It seems to me they have become that.
Yeah, there's an inherent need for an individual to be confident within himself, And to have that kind of confidence, you have to believe that what you believe is right, as you said. And a lot of men are strong enough to stand up and declare it.
And that's okay.
And fight for it.
But you also have to admit that there are others who can live very comfortably within what they believe as well.
Exactly, exactly. So, there is not a single answer.
No.
But it gives you confidence if you can get more people to believe your opinion.
That's true, that's true. Chris has assured me that he's going to retire from the Afghanistan run here.
Yeah.
And he's going to, what are you going to do? I don't know.
You
don't knit, so you've got to figure out something to do.
You know, I have, again, it's a theme that I've mentioned several times. I have a small boat, small sailboat, and I've found a really peaceful lifestyle where you live on the boat, you don't have shopping malls, you don't have, spend a lot of time offshore. I just want to get back to a simpler life.
A simpler life. You told me you thought you'd go to Cuba. That's not a simpler life.
Well,
I'm watching
actually,
Chris.
the Cubans are a perfect example of what we're talking about, no materialism, because they don't have any money to buy anything. There's nothing to buy.
There's no choice.
Yet they're very, very content people, and I've had the good fortune of being there for long periods of time, and they're very content people. So I don't think materialism and all this craving to own more and more has brought us happiness.
Well, I guess I have to say that it is always such a pleasure to have you, Chris Turner.
Thank you.
And I wish you well on your boat. And what is it? Fair winds and following seas.
Yes.
And we all wish you that.
Thank you.
And I am so pleased that you have been able to join us. And as we've talked to Chris about the Sturm und Drang of the Middle East, and the fact that there are some likenesses, and we need to look for our friends and cherish them.
Yes.
Thank you for being with us. It's our community.